Today, I am going to be discussing the chapter in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism titled The Bodhisattva Path. And in this chapter, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche discusses the Mahayana path and the six perfections. And again, which is usual for him, he discusses this in an unusual way. So he starts out with describing Hinayana. Sometimes now Gyalwang Karmapa likes to talk about the foundational path. But he uses Hinayana here. This is an old book. Here meditation is used to cut through our discursive thoughts, our subconscious gossip, which originates in the fifth skanda, which he talked about in an earlier chapter. And this type of meditation allows a gap in this endless discursive subconscious gossip. And it allows for some simplicity and some precision as the mind settles down. And it is our thoughts and our emotions that create our version of the world. And this starts, you might say, eating away at them, that he talked earlier about us all hallucinating these six realms. And now here he talks about it as our fantasy realm. But he's talking about it here, I think anyway, about our own fantasy realm within the general hallucinations of everybody. That we are all different in various ways, emotionally, in terms of our discursive thoughts, in terms of which of the conflicting emotions is most prominent in our lives, so that we specialize in one emotion. But on the other hand, he says that we visit the other realms throughout our lives. And here again, he's talking about in one body. He's not talking about when we die, then you go reborn in another realm. It's that these emotions that when we are overcome by anger, we are experiencing the hell realms. And when we are overcome with greed, we are in the hungry ghost realm. And when we are totally in denial, are just ignoring what's going on around us and in our minds and so forth, we're in the animal realm and so forth. That's what he's talking about here. At this foundation level, we get to make a connection with our minds, how it works, our particular style of discursiveness, and our particular style of our emotional makeup. So he says now the Mahayana level adds to this, that you don't leave the Hinayana behind. In fact, in other places, in other books and talks of his, he talks about you never abandon Hinayana, that we just keep adding to it. And you might say, look at it differently as we progress along the path. So the Bodhisattva level introduces Vipassana meditation. Quote, we must become aware not only of the precise details of an activity, but also of the situation as a whole. So we have this mindfulness, perhaps it's of the breath, or if we're walking, meditation, how the feet move, the sensations of the feet on the floor, and so forth. But with Vipassana, then we broaden our awareness to awareness of the space. And what came to mind is, I'm not sure which jazz musician said this, but the musician said something like this, that the space between the notes is as important as the notes. And so here we're beginning to notice the space where things are happening. In other places, Trungpa Rinpoche has talked about mindfulness awareness this way, that mindfulness is of the specific technique, and then awareness is just being aware of the whole situation. And that for meditators, not accomplished beings like Chogyam Trungpa, but for meditators, we put most of the emphasis on awareness, but we never lose sight of that mindfulness that keeps us grounded. But here, again, he is really talking about a very advanced stage of awareness. I'll also point this out, that again, in another book or talk of his that I either read or listened to, not in person, but he would say things like, well, I'm just finger painting here, that he's not going into great detail of what he's talking about. He's just kind of giving an overview. And I think it's good to look at these chapters that way, that he's just giving an overview. He's finger painting. He's not getting into the particulars. And one paragraph could be expanded to days of talks, and to keep that in mind. So going back to the space, that with this awareness of the space, this leads to what he calls panoramic awareness. This is, again, in his words, awareness of the patterns rather than just the details. So we begin to see our the patterns in our fantasies, the patterns in our discursive thoughts and our subconscious gossip. But we don't get sucked into them. That we begin to see them as our own projections, that it's just nothing but a projection. And we begin to get this glimpse of that there is another way of working with them, that they are not solid. He says this is what happens when you reach the first Bodhisattva level or the first Bhumi. And he talks about intense joy arising. And in fact, the name, the Tibetan name for the first Bhumi translated into English is the joyful one. At least for a moment, you realize you don't have to struggle with your projections. And that, needless to say, is a joyful experience. Briefly, a lot of confusion and suffering is gone. But the first bhumi is not stable, so he talks about it being a sign that can be used to help motivate us to keep continuing on the path. And so to continue here, he then talks about Maha Vipassana meditation, which is experiencing this vast space between us and an external object. That with this, we're not imposing any ideas, or not putting names or categories on our experience. We're just experiencing it. And he talks about this being an experience of openness. It's both all-encompassing and precise. And he says this is the open way of the Bodhisattva. Quote, it involves an open-minded willingness to allow oneself to be awake, to allow one's instinct to spring out. So he talks a lot from this point on about spontaneity. And so to make that point, he says we communicate or we say something, and then we let it be. And then there may or not be a response. But this is how spontaneity arises. So he says there are three types of people in terms of opening up. And the first one is completely ready to open up. The second is just about ready to open up. And the third category is have the potential to open up. So going to the third one first, these are people who are intellectually interested, but don't allow the space for their instinct to jump in. I guess in one way you could say they're too tight, that they are not allowing the space. And if you don't have the space, then you might say there's not room for things to arise. The next category is just about ready to open up. And so these are people who are ready to open up, but they're still a little bit too tight. They're watching themselves more than is necessary. And when he talks about watching yourself, he's talking about that we are continuously judging ourselves, seeing how we're doing, evaluating ourselves, and so forth. And so the third path, which is really the first one that I mentioned, is completely ready to open up. And the way he describes these people is that they have heard what the Buddha accomplished, that he attained enlightenment, and they have heard about the path, the way he attained enlightenment, and they feel it's possible for them to travel on it, and they are inspired. They have a certain amount of bravery, and so they open up, even though they don't know how, when, or why. So they have, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about Tathagata Garbha, which he translates as as it is. So this one that is completely ready has heard about Tathagata Garbha and is ready. They're inspired. They're ready to start on the Bodhisattva path. And so the Bodhisattva path is for the brave, that we need to have confidence in our Buddha nature. And that's what he is talking about here with the Tathagata, that this is our Buddha nature, our Tathagata nature. And Bodhisattva means that you are brave enough to walk on the Buddha's path. It doesn't mean that you are awake. It just means that we're willing to walk on the Buddha's path, follow his example, and so forth. So then he goes into the 6 transcendental activities of the Buddha, or excuse me, of Bodhisattvas. And now again, he's talking about them from a fruition standpoint, where they are going. And paramita here means arriving at the other shore. And these are practices that we do or that help us transcend this centralized ego. He talks about vision here as opposed to goal. And that's an important point. So he finishes this section before going into each of the 6 paramitas with this quote: "The Bodhisattva is not trying to be good or kind, but he is spontaneously compassionate." So the first paramita is generosity. And he starts out by saying this is not about being higher than another person, being better than another person, having pity on another person. It's about communication. It is about going beyond irritation. And again, he is talking about these paramitas in a very unconventional way. That usually generosity, they talk about making offerings to beings above you and giving money or other material aid to beings that need it. But here he talks about communication, that our irritation blocks our communication with whatever is coming our way. And because of that irritation, we don't see properly and fully. That we see our irritation, and then we become self-defensive and frequently just want to get away. So generosity is the willingness to give, to open up without a reason, other than doing what is required at the moment. It is not letting fear get in the way of our communication and the situation. Here we try to avoid judging and evaluating our experience. Again, this is referring to the watcher. We try to the best that we can, shall we say, avoid focusing on the watcher and judging our experiences and so on and so forth. The reason is that this blocks opening up and communication. We're focused on ourselves, and we're not really all that aware of what the situation is and what the situation is telling us, how the situation is responding to what we are trying to communicate. So we just see limited ideas, we see limited conceptions. He uses the term warfare mentality, and we need to go beyond all of them. So transcendental generosity is giving whatever you have without judgments. And the recipient either accepts it or doesn't. The recipient is either open to what you are communicating or they are not. They're either ready to receive it or they are not. Quote, such noble action, such complete action, action that does not contain any hypocrisy, any philosophical or religious judgment at all. So you're not even doing this because you're a good Buddhist. You're just doing it. And he finishes, or at least I finished this particular section by saying that ordinarily there's really no communication, that we have a made-up version of the object, a made-up version of ourselves, and a made-up version of the action. And when we complete the action, we are satisfied because we've done it our way, rather than spontaneously. So the next is discipline. And he begins by saying, ultimately, it's not about following the rules. Quote, if a bodhisattva is completely selfless, a completely open person, then he will act according to openness and will not have to follow rules. He will simply fall into patterns. Now, again, this is a very high level bodhisattva who you might say dwells in egolessness. So this is not something that we are capable of doing in the present, but it's great to aspire to be able to do this. So a person at this level, this bodhisattva, is open, he is aware, and he just acts according to what is. And as a result of that, he appears to act correctly, to do the right thing. He joins the chaos of life and fits right in. If we aren't watching ourselves, but being open and communicating with the situations, then our actions are pure. He uses the word superior. It wasn't premeditated. It was actually spontaneous. So if we can really open up the communication that's happening all the time, we become aware of it. And you could even say we dance with it. So he compares the Bodhisattva's actions to the walk of an elephant. That an elephant is in no hurry, is steady. Each step is solid and definite. He said an elephant doesn't make mistakes and they never fall over. So that is the way a Bodhisattva practices discipline. And this is a highly realized Bodhisattva. The next comes patience. And all of these paramitas are interrelated. They're interdependent. They feed each other, except for the last one, prajna. And actually, the first five, he uses the analogy. They're like rivers that flow into the sixth one, prajna. So patience, if you practice one, you practice all of them because, again, of interdependence. And also it is frequently described as you start with generosity, and then as your generosity increases, you add discipline, and as that discipline increases, you add patience, and as that increases, then you add diligence, and then you add meditative concentration, and then you spontaneously realize prajna. So that's another way of putting it. There are a lot of different ways. Lama Yeshe Gyamtso, who translated a lot for Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, and he's translated a lot for Karmapa and other great masters. I remember him once making an editorial comment when he was translating for Khenpo Rinpoche. And he said, if you ask 12 lamas one question, you get 13 answers. And so don't get too, what would I say, fixated if these things are described as slightly different by different lamas, or even by the same lama in different situations. So getting back to patience, that if we don't expect anything, you don't get angry. It's that simple. So the more we push, he uses the direction of forward, the more pushback we get. And I think all of us have had that experience in life, that the more we try to just push our way through, the more pushback we get. So the absence of desire and the absence of fixation on things does not leave any room for impatience. Patience feels spacious, that within the space, then there's room for situations to develop. And he finishes this chapter with this quote: transcendental patience means that we have a flowing relationship with the world, and that we do not have to fight anything. Then the next one he describes as energy. And in the section talking about it, he uses joyful energy. That here we are interested in his words, the creative patterns of our life and around us. And the joy arises because we are completely interested in it. Again, as we start experiencing egolessness, the joy spontaneously arises. And so this joyful energy, you could call it enthusiasm too, leads us into situations that here the Bodhisattva sees the way us ordinary beings see things, but he also sees, or she sees, the ultimate nature and is not seduced by the way things appear to us ordinary beings. As he progresses on the bhumis, he gives up trying to be a Buddha, and as a result has more energy and joy, and takes a tremendous interest in mundane things. And eventually, having given up trying to become a Buddha, he realized he has attained enlightenment. Quote, if we are completely open, fully awake to life, there is never a dull moment. So a bodhisattva is not bored, does not have, you might say, uninteresting experiences, that everything is of great interest. Meditation is the fifth paramita, and so he talks about two different meditations. And the first one is the meditation of the God realms, and that bodhisattvas avoid this type of concentration. And it involves a watching yourself, dwelling on something, a higher level of consciousness, a trance, bliss, spacing out, and so forth. That it doesn't have this element of panoramic awareness. So here, the bodhisattva has panoramic awareness and compassionate energy. That this awareness accompanies the other paramitas. That, quote, his action is always meditation, and his meditation is always action. And that reminded me of Milarepa saying at one time that I can no longer meditate. And what he meant by that was that there was no distinction between meditation and non-meditation. And if you can't not meditate, you can't meditate. So that's what's being talked about here, that no matter what you're doing, you're meditating. And on the other hand, what you're doing is meditation. That it cuts through this conceptual layer. And the last one is, he uses the term knowledge. Another term would be wisdom, that is commonly used. The Sanskrit name is prajna, Prajna. Its symbol is a two-edged sword that cuts both ways. So it cuts through duality and confusion. That's what it symbolizes. It cuts through doubt and hesitation. And it permeates the other five paramitas, that we need this prajna, this wisdom, in order to properly practice transcendental generosity and the rest. So it's a form of intelligence. And at this point, the watcher becomes discriminating wisdom, or discriminating knowledge was the term he used. So the two parts of this wisdom or knowledge is cutting through the conflicting emotions and revealing what one is. This is the egolessness of self. And the other is seeing the transcendent of, or the transcendence of primitive preoccupations of the world. Excuse me, preconceptions. I think I need a stronger and different prescription of my glasses. But anyway, it cuts through our preconceptions of the world. And so this means seeing situations as they are and seeing the egolessness of other. So we have two types of egolessness of self and egolessness of other. And just because you have understood one, realized one, doesn't mean you've realized the other. So that's why he talks about two different kinds here. So again, you at this point see things the way confused beings see them, but you realize it's an illusion. You might say you don't believe the illusions anymore. So the last quote, Bodhisattvas no longer experience the irritating quality that comes from distinguishing between this and that. So I'm going to go through the questions and answers now. The first one is, would you define meditation as paying attention to what you are doing? And he says, it is that, but it is accomplished by prajna, so that you are aware of the entire situation. This is that maha vipassana that he talked about earlier, that you are awake to the whole thing, and that you start by being aware of one thing, and then expand to two things, and then three things, and so on, until you are aware of everything. And he finishes by saying that if you are aware of everything, you can't be aware of something. So just emphasizing this panoramic awareness. Sometimes he will talk about an aerial view, to just seeing the whole situation clearly. And the next question is, what do you do when you have conflicts with others, making it difficult to relate to them? He answers by saying generosity is the desire to communicate, and that the prajna allows you to find out why you are unable to communicate. So first of all, we need a strong desire to communicate if we are going to get by these obstacles. And so there are possible blocks that he mentions. One is that you're unwilling to communicate, or you have too strong a desire to communicate. You're too intense. So look at those two possible faults, and then we need to see things from the other person's point of view. And we need to provide space and openness for the communication to happen. If the other person is talking, don't interrupt them. That sort of thing. Just allow for some space. The third question is, what makes us give up desire? So he says the discovery of the truth, that which is you can't become a bodhisattva until you give up wanting to be one. Again, we're talking at a very high level here. To surrender, that he says the last step on the path is, quote, Vajra-like samadhi, end quote. And at this point, you give up trying, but there's a lot of work to be done before you get to this point of giving up trying. So again, that doesn't mean, okay, give up trying from now on, just give up. And then he says that the glimpse that you get on the first bhumi really improves one's motivation to get to the 10th level. And then it is at that point where you give up. The next question is, does one become a vegetable if you don't care in your ordinary life? And his answer is that there is still energy there, but you don't put that energy into the kleshas, the conflicting states of mind, anger and desire and indifference or ignorance. That you remain somewhat calm or calmer, that there are energies beyond love and hate. And he mentioned some of them: precision, clarity, seeing through situations. He calls these energies of intelligence, and that they're constantly arising. They're constantly there for us to use, but we aren't aware of them. And he goes on to mention what he had said earlier about there's never a dull moment when you are in touch with what is happening right now. The next question is, does one know how and when to direct the energy? And his answer is, you must see much, much more clearly than before, that you have to see them as they are, that you don't have to force yourself to do anything. He talks about the analogy of a sun and a plant or vegetation, that the sun just shines, and that the plant grows as a reaction to the sun and the whole situation, the soil, moisture, and so forth, and then it grows. But the sun isn't intentionally shining, it always is shining. Then spontaneously, that was, I think, a follow-up question. And his answer is, yes, your action becomes very accurate because they are spontaneous. And there is a huge difference between spontaneous and just doing what you feel like doing at the time, which is impulse, or impulsive, which is actually filtered through habitual patterns and karma and so forth. And there's nothing spontaneous about it. So it's important to realize the difference between impulse and spontaneous. The next question is, what about aggressive actions? And he says these are associated with defending oneself, one's territory. That with precision, this Mahavipassana, this awareness of the entire situation, that it doesn't happen. There's no need to defend oneself. Then someone asks him about the story of Christ and the money lenders, where he drives these money lenders and currency exchange people out of the temple. His answer is that this was not aggressive. It was a truthful action, a beautiful action, that he saw the precision of the situation, the hypocrisy, And when he drove them out, he was not watching himself. The next question is, how do we make a transition between a passive state of mind and a more active, discriminating state of mind? And he says, well, first of all, you have to look at it in a completely different way. That we are completely confused, because when we do something, our mind is doing something totally different. That we need to allow the birth of intuitive insight. We have to see things as they are. And as this begins to occur, then we become more active, more penetrating, and the vagueness gets pushed aside. That's how we attain this more discriminating, active state of mind. The next question is the perceiver of the object that the perceiver sees. Trungpa Rinpoche's answer is that you have to be in no man's land to see things as they are. So you can only see things as they are when you are in the midst of nowhere. If you are somewhere, then you have a perspective, a viewpoint, so to speak. And he says, you can't taste your own tongue, think about it. And I would be delighted to have some discussion about that when I end. And there's only one more question, so then I will open it up to question and answers and discussion. So this last question is, this seems different from the Buddha talking about crossing to the other shore. And Rinpoche answers by saying, it's a paradox that you cross to the other shore, but when you get there, you realize there is no other shore. And I remember hearing this. I'm not sure of the person, the teacher that said this, but it could easily have been Taisitu Rinpoche. And it was, when you are on the foundation path, there are very, very few paradoxes. When you are on the Mahayana path, there are some paradoxes. And when you get into the Vajrayana path, it's full of paradoxes. The question is, when the Dalai Lama and others were fleeing Tibet, that they were facing the possibility of great harm if the Chinese caught them. Now, does that require aggressive action? And I believe that Trungpa Rinpoche would say this is truthful action, that you don't have the anger present. It's just that this is what needs to be done if you are going to escape and be able to continue benefiting beings. Khenpo Karta Rinpoche told this story, that he was in a large group of refugees, and it included Trungpa Rinpoche, and I think Kraling Rinpoche. They were all at the same monastery, and there were a lot of monks and probably some nuns and maybe some lay people. And they were all unarmed. And he talks about sometimes they walked in their sleep. They just kept walking and walking and walking. And sometimes they would stop. And so at this one point, they stopped. Meanwhile, the Red Army had gotten up, higher on a mountain and started shooting at them. And he said, everybody just got up and ran like hell. Those aren't an exact quote, but he said that there was one monk that got hit in the knee by a bullet, and they had to leave him behind. Nobody went back to get him. But this is the situation that a lot of these refugees were in. And some people did forcibly resist. But basically, the high Rinpoches advise just leaving rather than staying and fighting, with a few exceptions. So the observation was made that he talks about the Bodhisattva following the steps of the Buddha, yet a Bodhisattva will return in his next or her next lifetime to lead others out. So this is how this is commonly explained, that Bodhisattvas like Chenrezig and Tara, all 21 Taras, and so forth, are actually completely enlightened Buddhas, but they manifest as Bodhisattvas. And in terms of living beings, both the Dalai Lama and Gyalwang Karmapa are considered emanations of Chenrezig and are 10th level Bodhisattvas in the flesh. So it can be a little bit confusing that these that are less realized but are still Bodhisattvas, and there's a surprising number of them, but only a Bodhisattva can tell another Bodhisattva, and I'm not a Bodhisattva, so I'm just going by what I have heard and the regard that is given to these great beings. But they, again, they choose to return rather than to go on and be Dharmakaya Buddhas. So to explain this again from a slightly different perspective, there are the three bodies of the Buddha. You have the Dharmakaya, the Nirmanakaya, and the Sambhogakaya. The Dharmakaya is a formless body that is not experienced by others, but through the compassion of the Dharmakaya, the two form bodies, the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya, appear. And so the Nirmanakaya would be the actual physical flesh and blood human body. And the Sambhogakaya are these deities like Chenrezig, the Taras, Vajrayogini, and on and on and on and on and on. So the Sambhogakaya arises from the Dharmakaya, and is it spontaneous? The example that is frequently used is the sun and the sunlight, that the sun doesn't choose to radiate, it just does spontaneously.